Madam President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Rosalind Crucher, and fellow commissioners, Mr. Les Malesser, a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, members of Parliament and government representatives, Uncle Chika, colleagues and friends. It is an honor for me to pay my respect to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, to the elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islander as the traditional owners and custodians of this land. I also want to thank Rosalind and the Australian Human Rights Commission for the invitation to visit Australia this weekend to participate in this important National Human Rights Conference. I'm pleased to return to this country that first gave me refuge as a 23-year-old fleeing the Pinochet regime. I recall the solidarity, warmth, and generosity Australians showed to me at all times, although I cannot help wonder whether I would experience the same as a refugee today. I am especially pleased to join with you in this national conversation about what human rights means to Australians today and how we can ensure their protection for all now and in future generations. I commend the Australian Human Rights Commission for this important initiative. We all have rights by virtue of being human. But if we wait for our rights to be conferred top-down through law and policy, we will wait forever. Rights must also be claimed from the bottom up through empowerment and participation. The very process of discussing and debating rights can help us to understand their value and defend them with greater conviction. Through this national conversation, which I hope will reach the broadest possible cross-section of Australians, you have the opportunity to define a human rights agenda for Australia over the next 5 to 10 years and beyond. An agenda that can be owned by young people and those in an advanced stage of youth alike, as I always used to say about myself. From the newest Australians, from migrants and refugee communities, to the oldest Australians and the First Nations, the indigenous inhabitants of this land. An agenda for Australians in the big cities and in the smallest rural towns. An agenda for people living with disabilities, for women as well as for men, and for everyone who define themselves differently. An agenda in which business can see the value added in championing human rights, a human rights agenda for all. The national conversation will help you to arrive at a set of common goals around which you can build public support and with which you can engage the government. These goals can also be presented to the international community next year, when Australia undergoes its third Universal Periodic Review at the United Nations Human Rights Council. This is an important process in which every single country, big and small, is asked to take stock after 4 years of its human rights progress in consultation with civil society and national institutions like the Australian Human Rights Commission. Australia will report back to the other countries and receive feedback and recommendations from them. In turn, friends and colleagues, you are not starting this process with a blank canvas. The National Human Rights Consultation led by Frank Brennan 10 years ago generated many important recommendations. It is important to update and renew that vision today. The government's Human Rights White Paper in 2017 also set out Australia's foreign policy objectives in human rights, both in the region and in the world. Australia has worked through 3 national human rights national action plans, the most recent from 2012. Since that time, Australia has also heard the Uluru Statement of the Heart, a clarion call by Indigenous Australia for a constitutional First Nations voice to Parliament. We just heard a very impressive panel on all these issues, a treaty-making process, and a revelation of historical truth. I salute the elders and community leaders who have put forward such a powerful vision of justice and reconciliation, one that is fundamentally rooted in both traditional wisdom and human rights. Australia has also benefited from a wealth of advice and recommendations from the UN Human Rights Mechanism. It has ratified most of the core international human rights treaties and been reviewed regularly by human rights treaty bodies. Just last month, as Professor Croucher mentioned, Australia was reviewed by the Committee of the Rights of the Child and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Since 2008, Australia has received at least 9 visits from UN special rapporteurs who have yielded detailed and actionable recommendations on issues such as indigenous people's rights, health, foreign debt, trafficking in persons, human rights defenders, migrants, and violence against women. Why do I mention all of this? It's to say that there's no shortage of analysis and diagnosis, of recommendations and advice with which to advance human rights in Australia. Sometimes I hear Australian commentators bemoan all this attention, suggesting that the UN human rights machinery should focus its attention elsewhere. But this scrutiny is not the function of some international policing system enforcing rules from outside. It is based on international standards that Australia has helped to create, which successive Australian governments have voluntarily adopted, and which Australians themselves, people like you, have sought to engage and leverage in your effort to make Australia a better, more inclusive and humane place. In many ways, I think Australians have looked outwards to the international human rights mechanism because of the lack of a comprehensive national human rights legislation or charter. Australia will benefit greatly from a comprehensive human rights law to systematically protect all their rights. So I encourage all of you to include this important issue in your human rights discussions and in your human rights strategies and advocacy. Victoria, Australian Capital Territory, and most recently Queensland, have taken leadership roles in this respect by developing their own state or territory level human rights legislation. And I hope one day this can be achieved for the Commonwealth as a whole and for all who live in this country. In the meantime, Australians rely on a patchwork of laws that address different forms of discrimination. But several of these laws need to be updated, protection gaps need to be filled, and broad exemptions and reservations need to be clarified. The laws also tend to frame what should be rights in negative rather than positive terms, prohibiting certain actions, and creating the need for individuals to bring complaints rather than addressing broader legal and policy issues. As a result, the model is dispute-focused and remedial, rather than system-focused and proactive. I commend the Australian Human Rights Commission's detailed and careful proposal for synthesizing and harmonizing these federal and state discrimination laws. Friends and colleagues, let me reflect on a few of the issues that have already been highlighted during my visit, and I look forward to more discussions with various groups over the coming days. Yesterday in Melbourne, I had a chance to talk with different groups working on refugee and migrants, also committed group of activists and advocates for the rights of Australian women and girls. Australia has a significantly better track record than many other countries in the area of women and girls, but still, women continue to face many barriers, including unequal pay, workplace discrimination, and pervasive sexual harassment. And I have heard for a long time about the exceptionally misogynistic approach to women politicians by many men in Australia's political life and elsewhere in society. And I know from my own personal experience that this is not unique to Australia, nor will it go away overnight. But enabling more women to take position of leadership in politics, business, and society, including Indigenous women, will help achieve the vision of a free and equal Australia. I also discuss, as I already mentioned, with groups working with refugees and young people, Australia's heavy reliance on detention as a means to deal with social problems, and how disproportionately this affects certain groups, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Just last month, I met in Geneva with a 12-year-old Aboriginal boy from Alice Springs, Duzwan Hussan, the youngest person ever to address the Human Rights Council. I encourage you all to watch the documentary about him, In My Blood It Runs. I was shocked to learn that the age of criminal responsibility in Australia is only 10 years old. Some 600 children under the age of 14 are locked away in youth jail every year across this country. Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander children make up almost 70% of them. It is often the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children who come to the attention of the justice system at a young age. As a pediatrician, I have seen how far harmful this can be, how rarely it is in the best interest of the child. I very much hope Australia can follow the Committee on the Rights of the Child's recommendation to raise the age of an internationally accepted level of at least 14 years. Last month, the Committee of the Rights of Disabled Persons also raised issues around the segregation and institutionalization of people living with disabilities, and the continuing practice of forced sterilization of children and adults with disability, particularly women and girls. I welcome the appointment of the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation of People with Disability. Mandatory detention is also a mainstay of Australia's migration and asylum system. The people it affects have largely committed no crime. Many of them are in very vulnerable situations, and some are children, yet they are subjected to prolonged, indefinite, and effectively unreviewable confinement. These include those who remain in the offshore centers such as Nauru and Manu Island. And we have a wealth of evidence to demonstrate the harmful effect that this has on their mental and physical well-being. I know that Australia's asylum and migration policies have become entrenched over the year by successive governments. But I strongly believe that we are at a point where it is time to roll back these policies, or at least mitigate their worst effects. I encourage Australia to make greater use of human rights compliant alternatives to detention, which are non-custodial and community-based. Evidence demonstrates that this alternative reduces distress and harm caused to people, increase the likelihood that migrants will comply with immigration decisions, and are often a significantly cost-effective alternative to expensive infrastructure designed for detention. The so-called Medevac law that came into effect in March this year is another example of the practical improvement that can be made to the asylum seekers to uphold international human rights obligations and mitigate the harmful effects of detention. I am concerned that the plans to repeal this law may mean more and costly court battles, with lives being put at risk. I appeal to members of Parliament not to reverse the small steps programs that have been made. Friends and colleagues, one vital objective for any free and equal society should be a true reckoning with past human rights violations, particularly against Indigenous people, an acknowledgement of the many ways this legacy of violence and pain continues to scar societies today. A treaty with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and constitutional recognition of the First Nations people's voice in national affairs would be historic steps. These changes may require a sustained process of education, debate, and consensus building, but I'm convinced they are achievable. Australia has benefited from being a multicultural society with deeply rooted egalitarian traditions, and where the advancement of women has made great strides. But while the country as a whole ranks highly on most indexes of human development and social well-being, there are significant inequalities in the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, especially for Indigenous people and remote communities. So we need to make sure that strategies to address this have full ownership and design by Indigenous communities. From schools to neighborhoods, the workplace, and in every sphere of life, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people should be enabled to enjoy full quality of rights, freedoms, and opportunities. Friends and colleagues, as Professor Croucher has noted, this can sometimes seem a difficult time for human rights. not just here, but globally. It is essential that we take the time to think through what has worked and where we have done less well in responding to people's needs. And this is true globally, but also nationally and locally. Good governance and sound activism both need to ceaselessly search for new approaches, new strategies, new partnerships, new ways of working. Rather than labeling people who favor refugee pushback as bigots or racist, we need to listen and recognize the fear, anxiety, insecurity, or other factors that may be behind such attitude. We need to move away from abstract notions of human rights and discuss the human beings involved in a language that everyone can understand. We need to use reason and evidence and empathy to help temper visceral emotional responses. We need a conversation. We need to stop working in silos as women advocates, refugee advocates, indigenous advocates. In fact, we have to stop working in silos as human rights advocates. We need to find common cause with people working on the environment, climate change and sustainable development. We need to find new partnerships with businesses, with trade unions, with religious groups, with educators and others to expand the constituencies for human rights. Above all, we need to include young people. As Professor Croucher said this morning, their entire lives will be shaped by the decisions taken today, and they surely have a right to participate in making those decisions. We need their energy and their ideas to ensure we work better to respect, protect, and fulfill their rights. And we need the clear legitimacy of their voices in determining the future path of Australian society and the planet, which all of us share. The broad social movement that was mobilized in Australia on the issue of marriage equality is an inspiring example of what can be possible. The growing mobilization around issues of climate change gives us hope for the same. It shows that ambitious human rights gains are possible to win, that Australians do care and can be mobilized to uphold the rights of others. So this gathering reminds us that we are more than a collection of individuals. Together we can be a collective force for the defense and promotion of human rights in an age of tremendous challenges for Australia and the world. Civil society participation is the lifeblood of that effort, the vital force which holds up every healthy democracy and society. This is not about a niche concern of the human rights community or some globalist agenda. It is the business of each and every person in Australia from every walk of life. I thank you for the principled, often difficult work you all do. It is an essential effort of hope and positive construction of what I like to call strategic optimism. By anchoring ourselves and our society human rights principles, we can better face the challenges and uncertainties of coming years. We can be certain that we are upholding the true values of humanity and working towards free and equal societies. So I want to wish you very fruitful discussions in the course of this national conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bachelet. Strategic optimism, I like it a lot. And I'm just waiting for everyone to enter and vote there. I have another mechanism to talk to you with. Vote for the Slido questions, but I'm going to kick off by asking a couple of my own.
Well, I define myself strategic optimistic, but tactically not that optimistic right now, because the world is very complicated.
Right. At a time when a lot of people are talking about an erosion of democracy in a number of constituencies, it's concerning. But a lot of people talk about, wonder what Australia's role is on the global stage, given that there has been, for some time, criticism of our record with Indigenous communities, with the well-documented impacts of mandatory detention, as you yourself have pointed out. Does that mean that we cannot speak with impact or with credibility on a global stage when it comes to human rights? Or is it the case that no one's got a perfect track record on human rights?
Well, of course, first of all, I have to say there's no perfect society. Yeah? Even in countries who have for long years have been very advanced in human rights, like Nordic countries and others, they still have pending issues. They still have challenges. So every country has the need to look at themselves and see how it can ensure better protection and better respect for human rights, and to see which are the inequalities in each society and how we can advance. But having said that, I have to say that in the international level, Australia has been playing in lots of areas a very positive role, has been involved. Of course, it is very active in the Human Rights Council, and of course, it has been very active in discussing and supporting in international and different international issues, important positions in terms of promoting human rights globally. But having said that, I believe that when you are a country, that you are a developed country, that you have advanced a lot, and I mentioned some progress on some areas, it's bigger your I would say, your obligation to see and say, what else do I need to move forward? What else what are my pending issues on human rights? What are my historical depth, and how I can work on that? So I would say it has important influence, international influence. It's an important voice in the Human Rights Council. But it's also, I think, important when you say to other countries that they need to improve their human rights, that you also look at yourself and see what else we can do in my country to ensure that the same that I'm asking others, I am also be coherent with that position.
Well, that relates to the first Slido question we have, which is, how can civil society and the UN work together more effectively to help the Australian government implement more humane asylum seeker detention policies?
Well, I think that one of the things that the UN can support and provide is with evidence of what is the best practices and what are not the best practices. And in common with civil society, who knows the reality here on the ground, that could be ways of thinking of the best, if I would say, arguments, and also to build sort of a stronger support for change of those policies, for a policy that is more in compliance with international humanitarian law or international human rights law, to develop a policy, a national policy that is really looking forward to protect the rights of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants. On the other hand, it was unfortunate that Australia did not be part of the Global Compact on Migration, because what the Global Compact on Migration wanted to do is not to make it mandatory for a country to receive every migrant, but to have a way of a situation that is not local, that is international, is global. It's a global issue, migration, to find a global response to it, an orderly safety response. So to get out of that means that at the end you also have to deal anyway with the issue of refugees, asylum seeker, migration, but in an isolated way. So we believe that there's still a space for Australia to be part of that global compact, and I hope that the work that can be done with the UN and the civil society can, bottoms up, could help make the right decisions.
And I was really interested in some of the points you made towards the end of your speech, when you were talking about we need to think about it not as an abstract term, we need to involve young people, like how to get energy behind the public discussions around human rights. But one thing that I've discovered in Australia, and I think it's the same in many Western countries, is the idea that human rights has somehow become a partisan concept. And there was a former Australian politician, former Liberal politician, George Brandis, who said that he considered that to be one of the failings of the right in Australia, to have allowed human rights to be branded as something coming from the left. Have you observed this as well, and how is it best kind of countered that concept that human rights is political instead of above politics?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that in concrete, in Australia, I was surprised because yesterday I have like 3 or 4 different meetings with different groups. And one of the things that everybody said is we cannot use the word human rights.
Right.
And I said, in Australia you cannot use the word human rights? I mean, how come?
Right.
Well, but there is, I mean, and sometimes people don't use the word human rights, even though they don't label it that way, even though they are working on human rights.
Right.
And I think that's what Professor Croucher mentioned today, that some of the people who were invited would say, why did you invite me? Because they don't feel themselves as human rights defenders. They saw themselves differently. So there is an interesting question to ask yourself. Why is this? But that is why we are calling on avoiding politicization of human rights. Because human rights, first of all, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was developed, the commissioners were people, because the other thing that you hear, that's interesting what you say. You say, some people say this is leftist, and you listen to that, of course, in other parts of the world as well. But on the other hand, other people say this is Western ideas they want to impose to us Africans or Asians, and we have our own culture, and we have our own values and our principles. But the truth is, it's not Western. I mean, everybody speaks about Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was a fantastic chair of the commission.
Yes.
But the commissioners were from all over the world. I mean, not all over the world, because at that time, the majority of African countries were colonies still. But Latin America, both Chilean, Peruvian, Chinese, Indian, and of course on different other parts. But I'm mentioning this always because the one who included the concept all human beings was not Eleanor Roosevelt, was an Indian feminist commissioner.
Right.
Because at that time, the term that everybody used was the right of the man, that came from the French concept, le droit de l'homme, from the French Revolution. So at that time, women were included in men. But these Indian women said, nope, because government will use it against women's rights. So we need to speak about all human beings. So what I mean to say, there was the concept of Chinese, of everyone. And why was it? Because we were coming from the Second World War, and everybody was completely emotionally and rationally committed to avoid humanity from being again in that terrible situation. So the discussion was, what can be the conditions so everybody can live in peace? Well, it doesn't work so well because we had a lot of conflict, but at least if we ensured those rights, we could live in peace, leaving no one behind, etc. So this is not left or right. This is essential right of any people who thinks that dignity, humanity are important. As one woman, I was many years when I was at UN Women, in a panel with a judge with Africa, and she said, what is justice to me? Justice to me is that a child can be fed. That if my son is cold in the night, I can work him up. So I mean, we're talking about essential things. Probably what happens also is that many times we have been speaking about human rights mainly on the political and civil arena, and not on the whole range of human rights, social, economic, cultural rights, women's rights, etc. And now we're starting to work much more on other areas like environmental rights, or for example, technology and human rights. So the truth is that maybe what that former minister was, or political leader said, it was true that some other people did not feel ownership for this, but the truth is the rights belong to all of us, all human beings.
A bit like saying, I'm not a feminist, but I want to, receive equal pay and be safe when I walk home at night, etc., and vote, perhaps. Okay, so another question. What can we do to protect the rights of gender diverse people amidst a strong push by the US to remove any acknowledgement of the existence of such individuals?
Well, the truth is that in the US today, it's easier to talk about LGBTI communities' rights than to talk about sexual and reproductive rights. And we have seen that in some resolution of the United Nations, where it has been impossible to include that women, victims of violence and conflict, sexual violence, rape women, should have provision of services, of sexual and reproductive services. So we're not talking the women of the world, we're talking about rape women in conflict. And it was impossible to put that on that resolution because it was vetoed. So we are living in a moment where human rights and gender rights are having a pushback. And of course, LGBTI rights, it's something, I would say it has been progressing a little bit later, but you have seen progress in many places. But the thing is, as we talk on the situation of indigenous people, I think we need to, in the conversation, to include the rights of everyone to live how they are, the rights to everyone to love who they love. So I think it's very important to do those conversations. And I think the Australian community understood it because the discussion on the egalitarian marriage and what comes from it was very open and very supportive. But I think it's important to talk about it, to understand that we need to include everyone in our society. And the important is, and to accept the diversity is something that is positive to any society. And what can we do about it? I think we need to, that's what I was mentioning, to build bigger constituencies of human rights. So that women can also fight for LGBTI rights, that LGBTI rights can also fight for environmental rights. So we need to do something bigger so the voices are heard. And we need to reach out to other people. And we need to reach out to people who may have full of prejudices or who are fear of the new, of something that is different. And those people who separate them and us. And we need to talk to them and give good arguments why this is not what will bring the Australian society together, that we need to find how we all can be part of the society and contribute to it.
Speaking of big movements, and we've seen this global, beyond a stirring amongst young people when it comes to climate and the environment, kind of unprecedented in our time, accompanied by, of course, inevitable criticism of the 16-year-old girl who spoke so powerfully in New York a few days ago. The question is, like the recent climate strike, how do you think, and of course you spoke about young people before, how do you think students further advocate for human rights in Australia and around the world?
Well, first of all, I understand Greta. She's angry. She's angry because her future is at stake, and the future of other young generations at stake, and leaders are not doing what they have to do. They're not listening, or they're moving too slow. And we know that we still have some time, but it's not long. And if we wait more, we're not going to be able to diminish the temperature of the planet, and we will have the biggest violations of human rights ever. Because it's not something of the future, we're seeing it today. Today we see that climate change is producing, what to say to you, Australians, how you have biggest droughts, isn't it? And this year you're having one of the biggest droughts, last year as well. And this is, and water probably is being scarce, rivers and so on, and I guess also the temperature of the ocean is rising. You have the coral reef consequence, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not talking about something that is futuristic, that could happen and not. And then when it happens to me, I'm not young, I just say that I talk about accumulated youth, but because I believe it, let me pass a message to all of us who are not that young, that I think that youth is passion for things, to believe in causes and do things about it. I think that the opposition of love is not hate, it's indifference, when people don't care. And I think that youth cares about this thing. Not everyone though, but the majority of the youth. So let me go back to climate change, then a little bit about youth, because for me, climate change is really a huge threat for humanity. We see in the Sahel region in Africa today a terrible conflict between herders and farmers killing themselves because of the scarcity of water or land to make their own activities. We see in many small islands, there has to displace people living in the coastal areas because of the rise of the level of the sea. We see, and all this displacement, sometimes internal displacement, sometimes they go abroad because of the droughts, the lack of food security, the lack of possibility of having a job and an income produces migration as well. And I'm not talking abstract. Let me think on the caravan in Central America. I mean, of course it is because of insecurity. Of course it is about poverty, but also poverty that has increased because of a virus that's come to the coffee production that was the main source of activity of many of those in the rural areas, and they don't have any more jobs. They have to look for something else. So today, climate change is producing changes and problems and conflicts, and we will have bigger, I mean, and all this intersectoriality of issues will only come worse. So I think that when young people, and I was at Youth Summit in the UN, and there are people like Greta that she says is angry. There are other people who are a little bit different, but there was this young African boy who said, I don't care about you old people, we only care about us, the young people. But you know, the ones who are, we all were young once, and sometimes we feel angry about these kind of things. So I don't mind. I think it means that they care, and they want to do things, and they're doing fantastic things. So I believe that youth will mobilize, have been mobilized in terms of causes that they really believe in. And I think they understand that climate change is a threat. There are other areas where I think we could also engage. I mean, in countries where there is a democratic system, even though it's not perfect, because there's not such a thing as a perfect democracy, sometimes young people don't understand that political and civil rights are important because they feel they take it for granted. Yes. But there are other areas where they can be involved, even cultural rights, economical rights, or gender rights, being it women and girls, or LGBTI rights, or new areas, frontier issues that are linked to human rights and that we're trying to work very strongly on, like technology and human rights, artificial intelligence and human rights, because those are the challenges of the future. Because everybody speaks about Industrial Revolution 0.40 like it's fantastic. But the truth is that technology can be a fantastic opportunity, but it can be also very threatful for societies when you have countries that use facial recognition everywhere, and in that sense they can violate human rights, or through social media you can spread hate speech, and in the case of Myanmar, that trigger violence against the Rohingyas people. So all of the things have great opportunities, but also terrible risk. And I'm sure also young people, because they are so fond of technology, can also be important part of the discussion on how we deal with all of these very important things, but at the same time, we avoid the misuse of technology or social media against the rights of other people.
Dr. Bachelet, you have done astonishing things in your life and will continue to. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you so much, and I wish you a lot of success. And I will tell you the same thing that people tells me. Good luck.